Hello, I'm Ben Tuman, and welcome to Skipped History. Today's story is the first of a three-part series about the portrayal of Black history, or lack thereof, in textbooks. I read about it in the 1619 Project, created by Nikole Hannah-Jones, Schoolbook Nation by Joseph Moreau, and an article by Elaine Lewinek. In the 1619 Project, Nikole Hannah-Jones and a diverse group of authors and historians illuminate how the legacy of slavery still shapes the U.S. today. Their analysis helps to explain the unfairness of our criminal justice and banking systems, healthcare inequality, the several veto points of the U.S. government that enable obstinate politicians to block progressive legislation, and a whole lot more. And yet, as Jones points out, students rarely learn a detailed history of slavery, and middle and high school textbooks largely ignore the way that prominent men, women, industries, and institutions profited from and protected slavery. In this three-part series, brought to you by the same part of Inwood Park as every episode of Skipped History, we'll explore why students have rarely learned a proper accounting of Black history from textbooks. To kick it off, let's excavate a battle over a California textbook in the 1960s called Land of the Free that has particular resonance today. Up through the 1950s, the portrayal of Black history in textbooks was bad, very bad. Many textbooks still promoted lost cause mythology, which held that enslavers were terrific people. On the average plantation, the slaves were not harshly treated, read one popular text used in advanced high school courses. Many of the owners were kindly, humane men. Further, even the most progressive texts presented Reconstruction, the brief period after the Civil War when Black men received the right to vote, as one of the darkest chapters in the life of the nation. And much of the time, Black history was simply absent from textbooks. In a notable example, authors of a 1961 book for 8th graders listed a series of documents of freedom without mentioning the Emancipation Proclamation, which is kind of like going on Family Feud, being asked to name a terracotta figurine used to grow chia seeds and forgetting to answer chia pet. As the 60s wore on, publishers came under mounting pressure to fill these ludicrous gaps in history. Protests over the inadequate and unsatisfactory textbook problem began in Detroit, where Black activists protested and called out the city for a situation in which the Negro is made to pay tax dollars for his own debasement in school books. The outcry led the Detroit Board of Education to add supplementary reading about Black history to its curriculum, and large cities like New York, Cleveland, and Newark followed suit. And in the mid-60s, a publisher called Benziger Brothers responded to calls in California for better textbooks by hiring a group of professors to write a fully integrated book, where Black history was included in the national narrative, not just added alongside it, like me on a skiing trip with my friends. The authors were Ernest May, a diplomatic historian at Harvard, John Kagi, a professor at UCLA, and John Hope Franklin, a renowned Black historian at the University of Chicago. Together, they wrote Land of the Free, a history of the United States. The book broke from tradition by weaving slavery into the country's national story, describing the unwilling journey to America that Africans made, jammed by sailors into airless, steamy holds where it was taken for granted that many would die. Once in the U.S., brutal slaveholders gave them no more than was absolutely necessary. No Negro slave ever voted, the authors added. And for more than 100 years after the end of slavery, many Negroes were barred or discouraged from voting. Some still are. Relatively few women or Indians or Negroes have been elected to office. Now, to be clear, Franklin, Kagi, and May included much of the content students were used to seeing. The drafting of the Declaration of Independence, the signing of the Constitution, the World Wars, and Dr. Drew and the Blood Bank, famously the first bank to loan people blood. Or so I deduce. And the authors wrote in often patriotic terms, describing an ever-widening stream of liberty that runs through our history. But unlike pretty much all of its predecessors, Land of the Free didn't shy away from the challenges people of color faced. It explicitly discussed savage resistance to the civil rights movement from police, the White Citizens Council, the Ku Klux Klan, and mobs and assassins, reminding readers that advances by minorities are won only by continual and often painful struggle. As you might expect of a refreshingly honest and engaging book, people liked it. Land of the Free beat out its closest competitors in early 1966 and appeared on a tentative list of approved titles for California's 8th grade history market. But as you might also expect, some people really didn't like it. Most notably, the state's conservative superintendent of public instruction, Max Rafferty.
I guess I'm getting just a little tired of today's historians second-guessing the past instead of just telling us what happened, he said, indicating that he was just fine with the racist textbook status quo. Emery Stoops, a professor and friend of Rafferty's, agreed, assailing Land of the Free for being slanted in the direction of civil rights, with high praise for militant groups and condemnation for the great majority.
The racial undertones of Rafferty and his allies' statements were no accident. They were keen to draw white voters' attention to the book in a year when Rafferty was up for re-election. Mission accomplished. As 1966 wore on, and in a precursor to today's right-wing obsession with the 1619 Project and critical race theory, conservatives across the state complained that Land of the Free destroys pride in America's past, develops a guilt complex in white students, and overemphasizes Negro participation in American history. Others grumbled that the authors profiled negative thought models like MLK, who in the words of one critic was too widely known to comment on. And still others said the book was overly pessimistic. As a woman named Alice Albo insisted in a letter to the state, I am concerned with improving race relations, but I do not think it can be done by stirring up past injustices. Because, yeah, the brush it under the rug approach always works. Just ask Richard Nixon, the Catholic Church,
or my roommate whose assets were confiscated by the IRS and is now literally living under a rug.
The uproar over Land of the Free taught publishers a lesson. On one hand, the book was adopted by California after civil rights groups and historians came to its defense. On the other hand, Rafferty won his re-election in a landslide, and the racist fury he leveraged to bolster his popularity suggested to publishers that maybe Franklin May and Kagi had gone a hair too far in detailing the travails of Black history. Given that publishers also wanted to sell their books in the more conservative South, the prudent choice seemed to be watering things down to avoid political backlash. So, over the next 15 years, book companies adopted a compromise approach. Like Land of the Free, textbooks began including more detailed descriptions of the evils of slavery and the backlash to Reconstruction. However, after Reconstruction, discussions of white supremacy largely disappeared, especially in the 20th century.
For example, a textbook written in 1971 by Jack Abramowitz discussed how Strom Thurmond helped split the Democratic Party in 1948, but neglected to mention that Strom was a vicious racist who rejected the party's turn towards supporting civil rights. Similarly, the American Book Company published History USA in 1976, which described the slow but steady progress of the American Negro after World War II, but, like many texts,
never noted the obstacles nor the people who stood in the way of Black progress.
And as part of this white supremacy washing of textbooks in the 70s and 80s, publishers often omitted material that suggested racism might still be a problem. Instead, they focused on benign, inspiring contributions to society by people of color that kept alive the idea of racial progress. For example, books introduced readers to Deborah Sampson, a woman of color who disguised herself as a man to fight in the Revolutionary War. They also included inventors like Granville T. Woods, who obtained a patent for an incubator which was the forerunner of present-day machines used to hatch eggs, which is cool, but doesn't tell you much about Black history.
And when books did mention activists like MLK, he was, you might say, too widely known not to comment on, they took a bland middle road, emphasizing portions of his I Have a Dream speech and portraying him, in the words of Jack Abramowitz, as a man for all seasons, a man for all places, and a man for all men, which, sure, sounds insultingly boring, but is also how I describe this little guy, and he brings me endless joy. Tastes like chia. In short, Black history began appearing in textbooks in the mid-60s.
But thanks to the battle over Land of the Free, publishers inserted a white-friendly version of Black history into textbooks well into the 1980s.
As we'll discuss, the portrayal of this history and white supremacy didn't improve a whole lot after that. To understand why, though, it's worth exploring how a whitewashed version of the past appeared in textbooks in the first place. Tune in next time to learn more about that bit of skipped history.
Chia Pet, the pottery that grows. It's fun and easy. Soak your chia,